Okay, hello everyone, and you are all very welcome to the first Equality Studies Public Seminar 2021 with Maya Goodfellow. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't, you might put it in the chat to let me know. My name is Marie Moore, not in fact Owen Kinsella, as my computer appears to be telling you. That is the name of our school administrator, and this is the school account. So for those of you who don't know the Equality Studies Centre, it has existed at UCD since 1989 as an interdisciplinary centre concerned with the analysis of all forms of inequality, and it also focuses on the identification of key equality principles, objectives and solutions. So it's housed by the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at UCD, and it has members from all across the university, as well as forming part of a range of national and international networks and collaborations on equality matters. So as part of our annual public seminar series, we invite leaders and leading figures in the theory and practice of equality to speak to members, colleagues and friends of the Equality Studies Centre on key inequality issues and how we might tackle them. And today we're very lucky to have Maya Goodfellow speak to us on the topic of legitimate concerns, challenging the scapegoating of immigrants in hostile environments. Maya is a writer, broadcast commentator and academic. She is the author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats. She's currently a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield and a visiting fellow at the Sarah Parker Redmond Centre for the Study of Race and Racialisation at UCL. So today Maya is going to speak for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. Maya, I know you've asked me to alert you if you go over that, so I will. After that, we'll open up the floor for questions. So as we go along, you can feel free to write your questions in the group chat and I'll try and take note. You can also write questions directly when we get to the question and answers part of today's event. I can actually also unmute people if you would like to ask your question in person, in which case your camera won't turn on, but we will be able to hear you. Some people prefer that. If you'd like to avail of this option, can you please attract my attention in the questions and answer part, either by using the raise hand function or by writing to me in the chat to say you have a question that you'd like to be unmuted to ask. One final piece of housework, which is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the school and the Equality Studies website after the event. So that's it for me. In the interests of efficiency, we're going to try and contain the whole event roughly within an hour. So I'm going to hand over straight away now to Maya, who I think is going to also share some slides with us. Thanks very much, Maya. Over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming to this talk. I'm going to explain a bit in a moment about what I'm going to do for the next 30 or 40 minutes. But yeah, I just first want to say thank you to Marie, Ashley, and the university generally for inviting me to give this talk. I know that it's really not easy to be organising these kinds of things online. I mean, at the best of times, but obviously given everything that's going on with the pandemic, I mean, here in the UK, it's obviously incredibly bad. I know how difficult it can be, so I really appreciate you taking the time to put this together and invite me at all to do this. So as Marie said, I'm going to share my slides. So if you bear with me one moment. Okay, and if there's any issues, then please do let me know. So what I'm going to do for around 30 to 40 minutes is I'm going to try and do a number of different things, all of which are going to come under this this title that I've given this talk. And just to say, I primarily look at UK politics, or I did at least in my book, and so I'm going to spend the first part of the talk looking at the UK as a case study, in order to really look at the way that history's impact on the present. So in particular, thinking about shifts in immigration legislation, how the human impact of these changes, how certain groups are demarcated as undesirable, and how this, at least in the UK case, produced and continues to produce racialized others. But I don't just want to think about I don't just want to think about the UK. The reason really for having this first section looking at that is to try and think about the UK, in particular the UK's history of colonialism, its impact on the present, and why the fact that this isn't really very well understood in the UK, but also around the world, why this matters for thinking about immigration legislation in the UK and thinking about how immigration legislation impacts people. But the second part, I'm going to try and talk more broadly about some of the main arguments you find against immigration. This is something you find in the UK, but you actually find these arguments across Europe as well, and in other parts of the world. You find it in the US, Canada. You also find certain articulations of these arguments in countries like India, Brazil, and so what I'm going to try and do is unpick the arguments that are made against immigration, and I see these sort of falling into two camps: the economic and the so-called cultural. But before I do that, I do want to think about this history that I've mentioned, this history of immigration, racism, and colonialism, and how these sort of manifest in more recent events, and really, I suppose, think about the human impact of immigration policy here in the UK. And to do that, I want to start by talking about a woman called Joy Gardner. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about Joy Gardner and what happened to Joy Gardner. Joy Gardner, who you'll see on the screen, was born in Jamaica and grew up in Long Bay, Portland. She came to the UK in July 1987 when she was 34 years old, and she came to join her mother, who'd already come to the UK from Jamaica in 1961, but this was when Jamaica was still a colony of the UK's, and it would be given independence a year after that. So maybe you know, I don't want to assume that people know, but maybe you might have sort of gleaned this if you've read anything about the so-called Windrush scandal here in the UK. But because of the way UK nationality law worked, for Joy's mother, because she lived in a British colony, she, like many other people who were living in colonies and former colonies, was a British subject or a Commonwealth citizen. And so she, like many others, had the right to move to the UK. And this is something, as I'm going to say, is sort of regularly forgotten or intentionally or not intentionally sort of airbrushed out of British history, is actually the people living in colonies and former colonies had the right to come to this country. And this was written into law, so it already existed prior to the 1948 British Nationality Act, but this act really wrote it into law. So it didn't really give out any new privileges, but it did create a check against any kind of withdrawal of these existing rights to move. And this was introduced by a Labour government, but part of the reason for implementing this law was actually to do with the UK trying to retain some sense of power as the empire fell, in part because of movements for decolonisation, anti-colonial movements. The 1948 British Nationality Act is important because of the way that it sort of gave out or enshrined this right to move. But as I've said, this right to move isn't particularly well known, and so an example of this is the way that we talk here in the UK, the way that we talk about this history of movement. And last year, the BBC, or perhaps it was 2019, the BBC produced an information pack on immigration, and it included loads of different things in it. But one of the things that it did is it looked at the history of immigration legislation in the UK. And when it was doing that, one of the things it talked about was Asian immigrants who came to the UK in the 50s and 60s. So people like my grandparents who migrated via Uganda, came from India to the UK. They were called Asian immigrants in this pack, and in some ways you could make that argument because of the legislation that followed, how it's really widely talked about, but nowhere was it mentioned that actually the people who were coming at this time weren't immigrants at all. They were coming, as I've said, as citizens and subjects. And the reason why this is really crucial to understanding what happened to Joy Gardner, because what it meant is that Joy's mother moved to the UK in 1961, but there had been a big change. So as I'm sure you're all aware, these rights don't still exist. We have an incredibly restrictive immigration system here in the UK. And what had happened is by the time Joy came to join her mother, 26 years after her mother had moved here, so in 1987, there'd been a lot of changes to British immigration law. And so from 1962 onwards, there were successive pieces of legislation introduced to make it more difficult for people to migrate to the UK. And even prior to this, so even prior to, you'll sort of see the legislation on your screen, that 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, even before that was introduced, it's documented in places how between 1948, so that Nationality Act, and then 1962, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, Labour and Conservative governments did try and do certain things to make it more difficult for people to come to the UK from certain countries. And so these weren't advertised moves by these different governments, but really through like semi-clandestine measures. They did things like intervene in the market to raise the price of low-cost tickets for transatlantic crossings. And so there were a number of things that were done. But the real important thing is, both in relation to those more clandestine measures and in relation to this legislation, you'll see on your screen, beginning with the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, is that one of the central issues for both Labour and Conservative governments was race. And so from 1962 onwards, what you find is Labour and Conservative governments introducing this legislation, but it being implicitly about race. So it's not stated in the laws themselves, but the aim was to make it more difficult for people of colour to come to the UK. One of these pieces of immigration legislation in 1968, Commonwealth Immigrants Act, you'll see that was introduced by a Labour government. On the screen it shows there, and this is really one of the most racist pieces of legislation that has ever passed through the House of Commons. I mean, there are a number of others, but this is one of them. And years later, a conservative lord did say to the New Statesman, the magazine New Statesman, that this was about race. So if it had been about white people coming, actually there wouldn't have been this kind of legislation introduced. And so even though these pieces of legislation are called the Commonwealth Immigration Act, you see the 1988 Immigration Act, what Gominda Bamber, who is based at Sussex, actually said to me is that these weren't, despite their titles, these weren't immigration policies, but they were policies of racialisation. They were demarcating who belongs and who doesn't, and this was along the lines of race. And so going back to Joy, the British Nationality Act of 1981 was one of those pieces of legislation. And until this act was introduced, Joy would have had the right to British citizenship through her mother. So not entirely different, I believe, from the 2004 referendum in Ireland in terms of how people can gain citizenship. But the act, the ground for which was laid by a Labour government, meant that Joy couldn't get citizenship in this way. And so instead, she came into the country as a tourist and could stay here for 6 months. But after 6 months, she decided to stay on. And there's if you're interested in reading about what happened to Joy Gardner, there is sort of a lot of detail that I don't have time to go into, but there's a lot of back and forth with the state and immigration officials. She was very briefly married. There were attempts to deport her, but she was essentially trying to stay in this country because her mother was here. She had also in this time had a son here, and so much of her life was in the UK. But according to the UK immigration law and according to the state, she wasn't eligible to stay, wasn't allowed to stay, and so she was trying to find another way to stay in the country, essentially. And then in July 1993, a group of police and immigration officials turned up at Joy Gardner's flat to deport her. The Home Office had not told her at the time that this was going to happen. They claimed they didn't tell her because they thought she would abscond. So at the time, on this morning, very early in the morning, she believed that her attempt to stay in the country was still being considered. And the immigration minister admitted that letters were sent intentionally late to her solicitors so that she wouldn't know that this deportation was going to happen. And so her solicitors couldn't advise her. And so in the summer of 1993, a few months after Stephen Lawrence was killed, these immigration officers turned up at her home where she was with her 5-year-old son. And I'm not going to go into all of the details about what happened, because I think there's a sort of risk that we end up sort of fetishizing this kind of violence. But there was a struggle, and Joy was bound so tightly by these immigration officials and by the police that she suffocated, and she died a few days later. And one of the post-mortem examinations said that the cause of death was oxygen being cut off to her brain. 3 police officers were tried on manslaughter charges in 1995, but they were all acquitted, and there's never been an inquest into her death. In an interview for the collection Mother Country, Real Stories of the Windrush Children, which is edited by Charlie Brinkhurst Coffin, which I would encourage you to read, Joy's mother talks about this, but she also urges us to remember Joy as a student, as a mother, as someone who was studying media. She wanted to be a journalist, she says, before her dreams were cut short. And as I said at the start, part of the reason for talking about what happened to Joy Gardner is really to show the impact of, we often talk about pieces of legislation or immigration laws building up over time, but really to show the impact of that, to show the impact of these policies of racialization, as Gominda Banbra called them, to show that these aren't just sort of, the people that are affected aren't just faceless human beings, but there is a real outcome to these policies. But interestingly, or rather depressingly, before the pandemic, when I talked about Joy at events and what happened to Joy Gardner, I would ask the room, you know, a show of hands for who knows about what happened to Joy Gardner. And there would only really be ever a handful of people, if that, who knew about or know about what happened to her. And I think this is an indication of the fact that her case isn't particularly well known. And I think this really does tell us something about the normalization that occurs around violent border control. And really, when I was doing the research for the book, you just find so many instances of people dying because of bordering policies, whether because they're trying to enter countries or they come up against immigration enforcement in some form or another. And these are often treated as unhappy accidents, inevitabilities, or crucially, one of the most common things is that you find that the argument from politicians is that this is something that would have been stopped. So these deaths would have been stopped if there had been more bordering. So instead of seeing bordering as the cause or as one of the central causes, it's seen that bordering processes aren't harsh enough. And if they were harsher, then these people would never have been in these situations in the first place. But what it also tells us, I think, which is perhaps useful or important to think about more broadly, beyond just the UK context, is the problem with this term illegal immigrant or legal immigration. This is still really widely used in the UK, but it's also used in a number of other contexts, not least in Europe. And I think what Joy Gardner's life and death shows us is that people who are undocumented are just that. They are people, their cases, their lives, the ins and outs of why they have become undocumented is far more complex than this label illegal will ever allow, but also that their status as being undocumented or being so-called illegal is created, is produced. It isn't something that is just an inevitability, it is produced by policy. But we find that far too often in debates around asylum, for instance, there is this idea that there are legitimate asylum seekers and then there are people who are coming into the country illegally, pretending to seek asylum. And I know that this is something that is this been spoken about in Ireland, it's spoken about in the UK, is really commonly talked about in Europe as well. And maybe it's something that we can perhaps unpick a bit in the discussion. But as I said at the start, for me, this history is really, really important to grasp in order to understand the contemporary immigration system here in the UK. And so I suppose part of understanding this as well is, whilst I'm about to start talking about some of the more general principles, it is really important to know that the historical and contemporary context can be really, really important in order to understand how some of these more generalizable principles might operate in different ways in different contexts. And so whilst we want to draw connections across different places and times, it is really also important to understand the specific contexts in which we are working when we're drawing those connections. And so what I'm about to say, I'm not claiming that this is fully generalizable across in every single context around the world, but that these are some of the themes that I've noticed in operating not only in the UK, in UK history and now, but also in places like Europe. And so that's sort of a caveat to what I'm about to say. And so in the book, I argue, looking at the UK as a case study, I argue that the arguments against immigration, as I said at the start, come in sort of two overlapping forms. So they're not, in a lot of ways, they can't be separated, but just for the ease of sort of understanding and understanding how sometimes they're articulated and unpicking them, I separate them out into the economics and then culture. And so in the UK, the title of this talk is legitimate concerns in sort of quotation marks, because here in the UK, often these anti-immigration arguments are sort of, or people's anxieties around immigration are articulated by politicians as things that are legitimate concerns. This notion that people have legitimate worries about immigration. And although this might be said differently in different contexts, as in the words legitimate concerns might not be something that's uttered everywhere, this subtext, I think, is something that you find quite common in a lot of different places. And it's this idea that you shouldn't question or challenge people's anti-immigration views or their dislike or their anxiety around immigration, because they are automatically legitimate. And so they must be acted upon. And to refuse them as legitimate is to ignore these concerns and therefore ignore people who are already often ignored. So this is often framed as the sort of left behind. And so this was something that was articulated by Tony Blair a few years ago, where this quote from him, where he said, "You've got to deal with legitimate grievances and answer them, which is today why in Europe you cannot possibly stand for election unless you've got a strong position on immigration, because people are worried about it. You've got to answer these problems. If you don't answer them, then you leave a large space in which the populists can march." So I'm going to come back to a few of these themes shortly. But for now, I think it's really worth dissecting these legitimate concerns and asking if they really are legitimate. What do they do? What do they mean for people who are constructed as migrants? And how do they relate to a broader social, political, and economic terrain in which they're situated? And I would argue that actually the choice isn't between either ignoring these concerns or pandering to them, but actually addressing them head on, challenging them, because I don't buy that these concerns are legitimate at all. And so to break them down, I'm going to talk about the economic, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the so-called cultural. So as I've said, the first is economics, and so this idea that immigration is bad for the economy. And so this argument comes in a lot of different forms, this idea that immigrants are paradoxically at once taking jobs while also at the same time coming to scrounge off the state. So you find there's this idea that people who are migrants are taking up doctors and nurses posts that should be reserved for other people, whilst also being supposedly at the front of the queue for the health service and putting a strain on public services. This is something that is really talked about a lot across Europe, a lot here in the UK, and we know that this is patently untrue. Immigration doesn't drive down wages. It's not a significant causal factor in low pay. People moving to the UK do not create the conditions where people already here are exploited. That it doesn't make sense when you really look at it in a broader historical context. And interestingly, this often comes from certain politicians who are very happy to defend a deeply exploitative economic system, and they only really seem to care about its impacts or want to engage with its impacts when the discussion is about immigration. So some of the same people who say that they're concerned about the impact that immigration has on the economy seem a lot less interested in thinking about labour exploitation or the way the labour market is structured, things like low pay, 0 hours contracts, insecure work. And part of the problem, there's a lot of problems with this kind of argument, aside from what I've just said in terms of it being accurate. But one of the things that I found in the research, and this sort of is known, but I found in the research of the book, is you do find people who happen to be migrants fighting for better paying conditions all around the world. And so I'm not saying this to fetishize people's immigration status, but I think it's really telling that when we are talking about low pay and bad conditions, people's immigration status is one of the most important things. But when these struggles for better paying conditions are covered or discussed, which they are at times in the media, immigration status, the immigration status of the people involved seems to be of very little importance. And so there's this such obvious contradiction there in terms of how these things are understood. But one of the important things here, when I was doing the research for the book, I interviewed someone, Tatiana Garavito, who is a trained legal advisor and who is a campaigner. She herself came to the UK from Colombia over a decade ago, and she talked through her work and expertise. She's spent a lot of time thinking about these sort of myths. And one of her arguments, which I think is a really important one, is that when you're trying to dispel these myths about immigration being bad for the economy, the counter shouldn't be just to frame people as economic contributors. So whilst it's important to really reject this argument that immigration is bad for pay or reduces the number of jobs available for people within a given country, you can't argue against anti-immigration narratives by saying you're going to have an immigration system that is good for the economy, because in doing so, you essentially prop up this idea that some people are good and productive and some people aren't. And so you sort of, this slide is supposed to, in a way, illustrate this, that this isn't just a rhetorical issue. You know, often there's an argument made against some of us who are concerned about equality issues, some of us who are on the left, that, you know, you're just obsessed with language, or you're obsessed with is how things are talked about. And I have listened to that and thought about that, because I think there's, at least for myself, there's a truth that there's a risk that you only ever sort of focus on the way that things are articulated, which does matter, but in doing so, sometimes you lose sight, or I certainly at times kind of lost sight of the material and how the two are related. And I suppose when we're thinking about this, for me, this has been really clearly really clearly shown during the first lockdown in the UK. There was a pushback against the NHS immigration health surcharge, which is a policy that means that people, if you're a migrant in the UK, the chances are you're going to have to pay twice over for the NHS. So we pay in once through things like national insurance and tax, but most people, because of their immigration status, then have to pay the immigration health surcharge. So it's another charge, which is now around over £600 a year per person. And there was a push during the first lockdown here in the UK against this surcharge. People said it's not right. It's not right that people who are doctors and nurses, people who are care workers, people who are porters in the NHS, cleaners, who are migrants, are having to pay twice over for a service, a health service that they are staffing, that they are part of, that they are keeping going. And so there's a big campaign. The government eventually gave in, which at the moment is a big thing to get a win when the Conservative government have an 80-seat majority. It's not an easy thing to achieve. But the NHS surcharge was paused only for people who are health and care workers. There's not been really sustained, like as vocal a campaign now to end it for everyone. And so when I say it matters when you divide up the good immigrant from the like bad immigrant, or the useful immigrant from the less useful or not useful at all, that's because that allows us, I think, to think about how policy is structured, to think about how policy can differentially impact people. And so the reason why I have sort of these slides up is that's at the heart of a sort of points-based system, which New Labour did try and introduce. Now the Conservative government here are obsessed with, and is sort of something that is part of the Canadian system, for instance. Canada's often held up as this sort of example of a great liberal, welcoming country, but the new book by Harsha Walia really shows, Border Rule, really shows actually that what the Canadian system is partly built on is allowing certain people to come into the country depending on what their skills or qualifications are, but that right to be in the country is contingent upon this perceived contribution. And there's sort of like, here there's you can argue that it's an attempt to make a deportable population, or a population that's easy to deport or has very, very few rights. And there's a sort of similar mirroring with Canada that I think she really, really expertly sort of explains. And so when we're thinking about this good migrant versus bad migrant, one of the reasons that it really matters is how this then impacts the rights that people can access, the terms on which they're allowed into a country like the UK, or they're allowed into Europe, or a country like Canada. what you can access, what your rights are, how long you can stay for. These things really, really matter. And so it's not only a question of language, really it is a question of rights. But the other issue with this sort of economic that I think really does matter is this term economic migrant. It's really commonplace. It's used in academic literature, it's used in policy papers, it's something that I'm sort of doing some research on now. And one of the problems with it is that it's often used to refer to people who moved to the UK, quote unquote, legally, but are seen as illegitimate. So it's a really racialized term, as this image sort of suggests. It's racialized and it's a class term. So though this might change with Brexit, and it's historically quite complicated here in the UK, but if you look at the debate here, it's way less likely that this term economic migrant is going to be applied to like a French financier or a French banker, right? And so depending on who you are, where you're coming from, what your job is, this term might not be applied to you. And the reason this matters, again, is not just because it's about language, but because I think it begins to encourage us to think about the structural nature of how we understand movement and how we understand the global economy. And so we live in a world where capital can move with relative ease, but the movement of people, or at least the movement of some people, is considered a problem. So unless it's sanctioned and controlled by government in some of the ways that I've talked about, or unless you're like super rich and can buy citizenship, or you can buy your way into a country through an investor visa, movement is considered really dangerous in the hands of people who are poor or people who are racialized as a threat. And there's obviously also a gendered aspect to a lot of this. And so I often think, if people are moving, so there's debates about things like so-called health tourism. So if you park for a moment the fact that health tourism, there's like no evidence for this, I often think, okay, well, if there is health tourism, then like we should really be asking why. Why is it that people have to move, make incredibly risky journeys, knowing that there's going to be it's going to be difficult for them, maybe not knowing the specifics of that difficulty, but difficult for them when they arrive in said country. Really asking why that's the case. So if people were moving for economic gain, which again, when the people you're talking about it's not like people who are super rich, really I think it's important to ask why that is. And so really thinking about the levels of inequality that if you think about rich countries, whilst there is inequality within those rich countries as a whole benefit from a really unequal global system. And so I think putting it in this broader context, I don't have tons of time, I know I'm trying to watch my time, around 7 minutes left, so I can't go into great detail about that, but I think that the reason that matters is because we should be doing two things. One is, when we're thinking about that global inequality, striving to create a world where people should have the right to stay where they want. So the country, the city, the town they were born, people shouldn't have to move because of economic degradation or to access healthcare, or for whatever reason that isn't something to celebrate. So thinking about global inequality should really focus minds on that, creating a world where people don't have to move. What would that mean? What does that look like? But also, whilst trying to change that, creating a world where people can move if they want. And that means really challenging this idea that some people's movement is a threat. So the way to do that, from my perspective, is really to focus minds on borders. So look at bordering, the problems that are created by bordering, as opposed to people. So problematizing the border, not the people who cross them, recognizing that people are not the problem, but the borders are. And this sort of takes me to the next part of this, which is, I mentioned, is the other broad argument against immigration, which is culture. And so I've already said that some people's movement is considered a threat. And this isn't only about economics, it is, at least in the European context, about race too. And so there's this idea that immigration is a threat to culture and ways of life. And so a very good example of this is when David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, and his team were trying to negotiate with Brussels before the EU referendum, so what now feels like a very long time ago, they couldn't find any evidence that would satisfy the European Commission that immigration put pressure on communities. And so one of David Cameron's advisors said after the fact, there was no hard evidence. That is not to say that we didn't perceive immigration as a problem. Cameron was convinced that it was a real challenge, if perhaps more of a cultural one than an economic one. So you hear this culture argument a lot in a variety of different ways. One of the more recent things, which you'll see on the screen, is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, saying that they're, you know, unveiling this vice president for protecting the European way of life, and this being about immigration. And so this is an argument that's been around for a very long time, but at least in the UK and European context, you find that this has its roots in empire and conceptualizations of race. There is a constant denial that this has anything to do with racism, and part of the way that the people who make this argument explicitly sort of wriggle out of that is they reject scientific racism, so that's best associated with colonialism, and they say they don't consider themselves better. It's often white people making these statements, but not always. Don't consider themselves better than certain groups of migrants, often groups of migrants who are racialized, often people of color, just culturally distinct. So it's on these grounds that people coming from certain parts of the world are it's argued that they should be excluded, or in only certain numbers of people should be allowed into a country because they are culturally incompatible or threatening to, say, European way of life. Or, you know, if too many people come, then this European way of life is going to be undermined. And this is what scholars in the UK in the 70s called the new racism. And so to understand quickly, and I realize I'm like sort of rapidly running out of time, very quickly to understand this, Stuart Hall, the great cultural theorist, is really useful here. So in the European context, it really helps us, I think. And he defined racism as follows. He said, racism claims to ground the social and cultural differences which legitimate racialized exclusion and biological differences, i.e. in nature. So what he talks about is these two overlapping forms, racism's two registers, as he calls it. Biological racism and cultural differentialism. He says these don't constitute two different systems, but really they're racism's two logics. And so this shifts over time in different places, but in Europe we see this as, in particular right now, is it's Muslims or people who are perceived as Muslims constructed as being culturally incompatible with Europe, bringing crime, discord, and unwanted cultural change. And so very quickly, just to wrap up, in order of thinking about this sort of cultural argument, there's a whole load of problems with it, as I've sort of implied. One is there's sort of what is a static or bounded culture or way of life. What does that mean? No one place is sort of only constituted internally, and so this idea that there is not shifts and changes in terms of how culture is understood, I think is doesn't make much sense. But the other point is sort of going back to that Tony Blair quote that I read out before. He sort of implied that if you have too much immigration, then you're going to see a rise of populist far right groups. And this is a real problem for me in terms of how the culture argument is framed. So the problem, as that Blair quote suggested, is it's believed that anti-immigration sentiment, and therefore like the sort of rise of populist parties or the far right, is a product of a natural reaction to too many immigrants of a certain kind coming into a country. So this is an argument that the right have made, that it's been accepted by parts of the party political left. And it's true, people do express this so-called cultural anxiety. It does exist, I'm not denying that it exists. But the problem for me that it's treated as natural and inevitable, and it's sort of divorced from race, right? And so at the same time as Blair was saying this, the quote that I read out before, Hillary Clinton was also saying something similar. And, you know, she said, when speaking about the rise of populists, particularly on the right in Europe, Clinton said, I think Europe needs to get a handle on migration because that is what lit the flame. So this idea that immigration is to blame for the rise in anti-immigration feeling, this is long why people have argued that immigration control is necessary for good race relations. And just to end it, and I am now, because I realize I've hit my time, this argument is a sort of victim blaming one. It implies that to reduce racism or anti-immigration sentiment, depending on how it's manifesting and how you see it, you need to reduce immigration because racism or anti-immigration sentiment is a product of too much immigration. What this ignores entirely or almost entirely, or sort of sidelines, is the immigration has been problematized, certain groups of immigrants have been demonized, race and racial differences have been treated as if they're real and not as if they're constructed, culture has been treated as if it's bounded, static thing. And so what's ignored is the way that anti-immigration politics are reproduced, are constructed historically, as I talked about at the start, but also in the contemporary moment by the media, by politicians. And so that is one of the main issues with this sort of cultural argument for me, is aside from it being deeply connected to race, at least in the UK and European context, is that it assumes that this is an inevitability. And that is a real problem, because I actually think it's something that you can unpick and challenge. And so just to end, I guess, the sort of underlying theme of this whole talk and of the book is really that it is anti-immigration politics and not immigration that is the dangerous and disruptive and damaging force, and that is where the starting point should be in order to challenge it. But I realize I've hit my time, so I'll end there.